welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King, editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal. Here, this is everything you need to know about public policy and politics in North Carolina each week. This week, we've got, of course, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation. He's going to be giving us a lot of information about some key legal decisions that came down this week. Brianna Kramer, Carolina Journal's public policy reporter, is going to be talking about immigration, a big issue for North Carolina voters. And Jeff Moore, deputy editor of Carolina Journal, we're going to be talking about the latest on the Congressional District 6, Mark Walker, everything you need to know about that. And of course, David Bass, reporter for Carolina Journal, has the latest in our new polls. So Carolina Journal has a new poll we're going to be bringing to you many times during the year, especially on this really important election year in 2024. We have the latest information on what voters think. It's one of the first polls really in the field after this primary. All right, what did you find out from North Carolina voters right in the hours after the polls closed on the primary?
Yeah, very interesting results. So, of course, topping the list is everyone's interested in the presidential race. How does that stack up? In 2020, of course, North Carolina was extremely close between Trump and Biden. In fact, I think it was the closest state that Trump won. Of the states Trump won, North Carolina was the narrowest margin. So the poll that the Carolina Journal dropped this week showed that Trump was leading 45 to 40 with Biden. So much more comfortable lead there than what he actually won in 2020, if that holds up. And then, of course, also we had a race for governor that was polled. Mark Robinson recently secured the nomination on the Republican side in that race. Josh Stein on the Democrat side. What the poll results were was Robinson leading 44% to Stein's 39%.
Wow, that's
very
a bigger
interesting
lead than
there.
I thought.
Yeah, because there's a lot of talk about, with Mark Robinson. He's a non-traditional candidate in terms of very much in the Trump vein of speaking his mind on certain issues and not being afraid to kind of jump out there. So it'll be interesting to see how he handles things this year. But so far with these poll results, he's ahead of Stein, definitely. Not to change gears to another poll, but there was another poll with WRAL that also monitored the gubernatorial race. That one was a little bit narrower. There was about a 2% gap between Robinson and Stein. But interestingly, that poll actually found a lot of support among young people for Robinson, which was interesting. I think one issue that will come up is how well Robinson will do among black voters, too, with being the first, if he won, the first black governor in North Carolina history. So some interesting things there. I just mentioned quickly, we also polled the Attorney General race, that one between Republican Dan Bishop and Democrat Jeff Jackson. And Bishop was leading 41% to Jeff Jackson's 39%. So a little bit narrower there. That's going to be a really big council of state race this year. Attorney General, AG, sometimes stands for almost governor. A lot of times that's the individual in that position will go to run for governor. So that'll be a big race. A lot of other council of state races, it was really good news for a lot of Republicans. So for labor commissioner, treasurer, insurance commissioner, all of those races, Republicans were leading on this initial poll.
Now tell me about the methodology a little bit. Or is this just Republican voters? Is it a cross section?
Yeah, so it's a cross section. It's likely voters. It was 600 likely voters. Again, the poll was put out in the field shortly after the primary. So this is very recent. This is current.
And it's Democrat and Republican voters.
Democrat and Republican. It's a cross section of voters in North Carolina, kind of represent the entire.
That's really powerful. So that is good news, more so than I would have thought. What were your thoughts on the poll?
Yeah, I was interested to see the matchup with Stein and to see that there was a little bit of a gap there. I don't know what the margin of error in this poll is, but 4 or 5 points is a pretty considerable lead when you see the other polls coming in at just a couple. Be interested to see how much drop-off there may be from Trump's numbers to Robinson's numbers. You have similar candidates, and they can be fiery and attract a lot of controversy with some of the statements, everything that they've made. But you wonder how well Trump may do and pull up the entire ticket, and Robinson's going to be right there behind him. And so if he's tracking closely with Trump's numbers here, I think that bodes very well for him, because I think everyone assumes, I think we've had it mentioned on this show before, that he may poll just a little bit behind Trump. So if Trump wins big, then it would be good for Robinson. If Trump wins at a margin that he did in 2020, just about 1.3%, then that may be a little bit harder challenge for Robinson.
Sure, sure, but that's what everybody's been watching, right? The general election. Can he may be able to win the primary? Can he win the generals? This indicates that he might be able to.
Yeah, it looks like the support is there, and you've got to think that in an election this big, with the presidential race going on,
Sure.
that the generic ballot advantage that the Republicans seemingly have here in North Carolina is going to carry a lot
Sure.
for voters. And so as you work your way down that ballot, and you're going to governor, and you're getting to things like superintendent of public instruction, which they said that was an upset primary there, and
Right.
and some entities have worried that they may be put them in a weak position in the general election, but maybe not. You have to see how much that generic ballot advantage really carries.
Sure.
The
Now,
entire
speaking of the generic ballot, tell me a little bit. Do you think this extends to the state legislature? That's critical for Republicans in really setting policy.
Absolutely, yeah. The poll actually showed some interesting results for the state legislative races.
Okay.
So 42% of likely voters plan to vote for a Democrat
Okay.
in the legislative races, while 48% plan to vote for a Republican. So definitely a strong lead on the Republican side, which could have interesting results because they're fighting to keep their supermajorities right now in
Sure.
the General Assembly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. What did you notice in the poll?
Yeah, first of all, on the generic ballot, it's always interesting. We talked about the legislative race and it was a
Right.
similar gap for the congressional race, but we always have to remember people don't vote for generic candidates.
True.
They vote for candidates, and the districts are drawn such that in some places it's almost guaranteed that a Democrat's going to win, while in other places it's almost guaranteed a Republican's going to win. It'll really, on those legislative and congressional races, depend on how people respond to particular candidates. I think one of the other things that was interesting is every head-to-head race that we did, the Republican was leading. Margins were larger in some cases than in others. The largest margin, interestingly enough, was Luke Farley, who was kind of a surprise winner in the labor commissioner race, but had a 7-point margin.
Sure.
And the margin of error was asked about earlier is almost 4 percentage points. So to be beyond the margin of error, you've got to be at about 5. And he was at about, Luke Farley was about 7 over Braxton Winston in that labor commissioner race. The races that were within the margin of error were that Jackson versus Bishop race for Attorney General, also the race for superintendent between Michelle Morrow and Maurice Moe Green, and the state Supreme Court race where Allison Riggs is an appointed incumbent, a Democrat, running against the Republican Jefferson Griffin, who's on the Court of Appeals. All of those very close.
Sure, sure. Do you think this is an anti-establishment poll and election? Because you look at Michelle Morrow, Luke Farley, even Mark Robinson, it looks like we've got a real populist trend happening going into 2024. And folks have been saying that was going to happen. I just didn't think it would be this pronounced so early.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a lesson coming out
Sure.
of the primary, was a few surprises with populism versus kind of establishment candidates.
Right.
And to the point of the superintendent race as well that Mitch was mentioning. So what we brought up on the show last week was the big surprise with Michelle Morrow ousting Superintendent Catherine Truitt, who was the incumbent. So the poll result, within the margin of error, but the poll result actually found that she was leading 41% to 39% over Moe Green. So very narrow lead there, but I think somewhat interesting that even in that race, that was a surprise to many, that she's already leading, at least in these early poll results.
We're going to be following these closely. Let's go to Mark Walker. We're talking about Congressional District 6. I was actually surprised that it was going to be that close with Addison McDowell and Mark Walker, but now there's not going to be a runoff.
There's not going to be a runoff anymore. Mark Walker has dropped out of the runoff campaign. He actually never filed the paperwork
That's what I was
to runoff. So people were wondering, is he or isn't he? And
Okay.
there were a few tweets out challenging McDowell to a debate. And so people thought, well, maybe he's going to file that runoff paperwork. And then the news came out, I think just the very next day, that he is going to pull out of the runoff of that race, actually join the Trump campaign.
Okay.
So the Trump campaign and former President Donald Trump issued a statement on Truth Social, I believe, that described that he's going to come onto the campaign, work with his faith groups in minority outreach operations. That is going to right in the wheelhouse of Mark Walker, who is a former Baptist minister, and definitely, and it has a lot of carry with those groups across North Carolina. It's done a lot of campaigning across the state in North Carolina with faith groups, with minority groups. And so this is an area that's in his strength. So he joins the Trump campaign with something in his wheelhouse, has a gracious exit from a runoff, which could be messy, and that actually kind of keeps his political capital alive for the future. So if you're looking to run for a seat down the road, you haven't really burned a whole lot of bridges here with this kind of exit. Addison McDowell, the other candidate there,
Walks right
endorsed
in.
by Trump, he's going to get in there with the way that district is set up. And so Mark Walker is going to have a piece of the Trump campaign to deal with, and then after, who knows what his political future may hold. But for now, that makes the 6th district a little bit more simple to predict here. And an interesting note that Dallas Woodhouse actually made was that without a runoff in the 6th district, it may affect the runoff in some of these other races, like for Lieutenant Governor between Hal Weatherman and Jim O'Neill. Jim O'Neill is from that 6th district area. So if there was a runoff going on there, it might help pull more people into that statewide runoff race. So so it has some ripple effects beyond just the 6th district race.
Give us a little bit of the backstory for Mark Walker, because this, for him to join the Trump campaign after kind of a rocky road with Trump and endorsements, he might be laying out a path for the future for himself.
Yeah, and it really shows that in politics, memories can be very short as far as what the relationships are like. And so Mark Walker was in Congress for several terms. He rose to be leader of the RSC. He dealt with Trump in the White House. Got that district changed, and he came out of elected not to run for Congress. He went up in a Senate primary against former Governor Pat McCrory and Ted Budd, who was eventually the victor in that primary for Senate. And then in that primary, Trump came out and endorsed Budd in a way that was seemed to be kind of a slap in the face to Walker, who's in the front row, I believe,
Pat McCrory,
with his family. And they each either not knowing that something like that was going to happen, or maybe anticipating something different, like he maybe put his weight behind another candidate. And so there's a big falling out between Trump and Walker, I guess, politically after that point. So when they mend fences like this, it's interesting to see, and it kind of reminds us how much of politics is performative. So a lot of it, and they're kind of jousting back and forth, and there's lots of political capital to exchange and relationships to maintain. But then at the end of the day, when the opportunities really align and you can get together and help a Republican campaign for president, have a role in North Carolina, after looking at a runoff that may not have been too favorable for you, Trump was endorsing the other candidate. He was going to come to maybe Greensboro, have a big rally, and then potentially bury the Walker campaign with something like that, with all the attention it would get. So I think this is a smart move. It's a gracious move politically, and I think that it probably pays dividends out into the future.
Sure. Mitch, Democrats have to be going, why didn't we put somebody in there? Because right now, they don't have a candidate in the 6th. That means Addison Walker's going to get a bye, basically, to go to Congress.
Addison McDowell, yes.
McDowell.
And I'm guessing that the main reason that they didn't is they saw that this is a Republican district now. Kathy Manning was the one-term incumbent. She was in that district because the courts forced a map upon North Carolina that made it a very Democratic district. Once lawmakers had a chance to redraw the district, Democrats looked at it and said, we're not winning this one. Why even bother? Kathy Manning didn't bother. No one else filed. So, Addison McDowell does end up getting a free pass, which is tough for the Democrats in trying to win in other places. Republicans don't have to spend any money there now that McDowell's going to move forward. I think there are a couple of interesting things that come out of this. A reporter asked me, once Walker dropped out, does this mean that he's never going to be able to run for office ever again? And I said, no, it's probably exactly the opposite. He's not yet 55, so he certainly has an opportunity to run again. And by getting out of a runoff that he would have a very strong chance of losing, because he was the second place finisher, and the other two main candidates had endorsed McDowell along with Donald Trump, he gets to avoid having another loss that would be a black mark on his record. He gets in with the Trump team, and as long as everything goes okay among them, he'll probably have some goodwill there, and that will set him up for something else in the future. Jeff pointed to a very important point on these other runoffs. Now that there is no runoff there, the only ones left are the 13th district, the congressional primary there, and then two statewide Council of State races, lieutenant governor and auditor. And lieutenant governor, Jim O'Neill, would have been helped if people had to go out and vote for that. He's not going to get help, so that's probably a boon for Hal Weatherman in some respects.
Could a third party come in there at the last minute and rock the boat for Addison?
No. I mean, filings done, so he's
Yeah.
basically going to go on and,
Sure.
and win.
Sure. All right. I'm going to actually stick right with you if you could. Some judicial rulings out this week may have an impact on 2024 or not. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, certainly it could have an impact on 2024. There are a bunch of election lawsuits,
Okay.
and we could talk about for hours about all of them, but we won't. We'll limit it to just a couple of them at this point. One is voter ID. Anyone who voted this time around
Sure.
knows that you had to have a voter ID this time around. That's because even though an ID law was passed in 2018, court cases have been blocking voter ID in North Carolina up through last year. The state Supreme Court in April of 2023 said that voter ID was fine, it was constitutional, and so the voter ID law went back into effect. But as soon as that happened, the people who don't like voter ID went back to a federal court case that had been sitting dormant for a couple of years and tried to revive that. So what has happened there is there was a motion filed back in 2021 by the State Board of Elections to kill the federal court case. And just this week, Judge Loretta Biggs, who's no fan of voter ID and tried to block it before, she threw out the State Board of Elections motion, said, no, we're not going to give you summary judgment. There's going to be a trial. It's going to be May 6th. So there's going to be a trial on the federal case of voter ID. That could end up affecting whether we have voter ID for the general election. Because if she strikes it down, and she's already indicated she doesn't think that it is viable with the Constitution. If she strikes it down, then the state would have to rely on the Fourth Circuit or the Supreme Court to step in and say, no, this law is fine.
Sure.
But that might not happen before the general election. So it could throw out voter ID before the general election. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself
Sure.
because you still have to have a trial
Yeah.
and you still have to see what happens. But given what Judge Biggs has ruled in the past,
Mhm.
she doesn't seem to be a fan of voter ID. And so
Okay.
we'll have to watch that very closely. Very quickly on two other
Sure.
things. We know there have been a number of suits over the years called Cooper v. Berger,
Sure.
the Democratic governor against the Republican legislative leaders, including Phil Berger. The two latest Cooper v. Berger suits, one of them deals with appointments to state boards like the Environmental Management Commission and Wildlife Resources Commission. Cooper targeted 7 of those boards because he said the General Assembly was stepping on his power. A 3-judge panel recently said that 5 of the 7 boards were fine, and that 2 of them, the group that gives the targeted incentives in North Carolina, and also the State Board of Transportation, they threw those out because the General Assembly gave itself too much authority. But 5 of the 7 were upheld. Now, every party in the case, Cooper,
Okay.
the state, and the legislative leaders have all appealed. So that case is going forward. The other one is dealing with the State Elections Board. There was a change that was proposed. Right now we have an elections board that has 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans because Cooper's a Democrat and the governor's party gets to control which party has the advantage. The General Assembly passed a law that would throw out that board and make a new 8-member elections board with 4 members from both major parties. A 3-judge panel, not the same one as the other Cooper Berger case. The 3-judge panel threw that elections board out this week. Now the state legislature has appealed, so we'll see what happens. That could have an impact. My guess is at this point, we'll probably have the elections board we have through the end of this cycle, because if it gets through all of the various court incarnations, it probably won't be resolved before November of 2024.
Okay, all right. Let's go back to the voter ID one. You wrote a great story about implementation of voter ID.
Mhm.
How did it go? Because I think for a lot of us, we kind of assumed the voter ID was here to stay.
Yeah.
And what if it isn't? So
Yeah.
how did it go for this primary?
Yeah, I thought it was here to stay too.
Yeah.
I mean, in the primary election, there were no issues reported at all. I talked to election officials here in Wake County that said everything was going very smoothly with the transition. Really, the big change that they had to make was just signage at all of the polling locations and just making everybody aware of the change for voters and for poll workers, just so everybody was on the same page about voter ID. So there were no issues being reported really anywhere.
Sure. What are your thoughts on this?
It's like deja vu all over
Right.
again. Just to hear about the loss of Cooper v. Berger, or just the struggles between the governor and the legislature, the lawsuits over voter ID. Of course, we'll talk about redistricting sooner rather than later, probably.
Sure.
And so I wonder, as we go through this, like we've all kind of seen this movie before, if voter ID is taken away for the general election, it really is just like, oh, here we go again. But I wonder what is next after all these issues, and this is maybe kind of a larger thought, but after these issues we've been dealing with for the last 10 years that we're all very familiar with if you've been paying attention to North Carolina politics, when they do start getting definitively resolved, what is next for North Carolina? Because we'll have to come into a new suite of different issues and power struggles and policy choices that we'll focus on. And it's not clear to me exactly what that is because we've been dealing with the same kind of portfolio of issues for the past kind of 8 years or so.
Right.
It seems like.
Actually, that's true because to a degree, that Cooper-Berger balance of power has empowered both sides, and they've probably been able to tap into it to really move their base.
And especially empowered lawyers who work on these things, and they aren't going away, so there are going to be lawsuits about something.
Yeah, of course. What do you think, David?
Yeah, it's just interesting to see that we've had voter ID in place for a couple municipal election, now primary, and just to see it didn't stem turnout at all. It didn't it wasn't this onerous thing that was claimed that it could be. Interesting from our poll, the question was actually asked, do you have a voter ID in the poll? And there was about 2% of respondents who said they didn't. So the vast majority, of course, said they did. So just another interesting factoid
That's
there.
interesting. That could show up. I'm going to actually come back to another poll question that we talked about, the most important issues. Most people, when they came to the polls, what were they really voting on? The economy, education, whatever. What was the top one?
The number one issue for North Carolina voters is immigration.
Immigration.
Yeah, even though we're far away from the southern border, it's turning into an issue in every single state, an issue that North Carolina voters are really keying on as we head into the general election now.
Right, absolutely. So you had a great story about ICE detainers. This is something that I didn't quite understand because to me, I thought those who weren't honoring it weren't following the law, but you had a chance to really sit down and talk with some sheriffs and find out what is going on. Tell us.
Yeah, so let me give you a little background info. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they can issue a detainer, and a detainer is a public safety tool that is focusing on the removal of a non-citizen who has been arrested for criminal activity. So really, ICE can issue this detainer, and most sheriffs here in North Carolina honor that detainer, and they'll hold that non-citizen until ICE shows up and can take custody so that they can remove that person in accordance with federal law. But there are about 6 counties here in North Carolina that are kind of referred to as sanctuary jurisdictions, and they don't fully cooperate with ICE. So I talked with a couple different sheriffs on each side of the aisle. In Rockingham County, we have Sheriff Sam Page, and he fully cooperates with ICE and supports what they're doing because he says that we need to get criminals off the streets and to protect the community and also protect the immigrant communities too. So he is in support of the Trump-era policies, Title 42, and the Remain in Mexico policy. And one of his main concerns is reoffenses if people are let back out onto the streets. On the other side of the aisle, in Mecklenburg County, we have Sheriff Gary McFadden. And he doesn't cooperate with ICE fully. He actually says that there's differences in the policies and that it's actually unlawful for him to fully cooperate with ICE because that's a federal employee that's telling him that he needs to keep an immigrant longer in custody when a judge is telling him that it's time for that person to be released. So he actually referred to General Statute 162.62, which states that if a person meets all of the requirements and conditions for their bond, they have to be released. And so that's what he refers to and says a ICE agent doesn't supersede a judge's order. So I'm going to listen to the judge.
Okay, all right, good. So what is the Sheriff's Association telling you? Because they are like right in the middle of this.
They are in the middle, but they aren't taking a stance actually, because they do acknowledge that there are differing policies at the state and federal level, and so they say that this needs to go to a federal court, and a lawsuit is going to need to be filed, and a court is going to have to issue an opinion on this matter before they really know which side to take.
Oh, interesting. Now that means that it would then become a story that you were working on.
Probably could be. This is something that's been brewing for quite a while now. We know that there's been legal action. There's also been action at the General Assembly, bills filed and passed to force sheriffs to work with ICE that then have been vetoed by Governor Roy Cooper.
Okay.
So there's been a lot of activity to try to ensure that sheriffs will work with ICE, but those who are elected in the counties that they don't want to do it, I mean, that they basically could say, well, force me. I mean, I'm an elected official. You can't tell me what to do.
Sure.
And they don't like to do this. And that's something that actually has been something that's been in play in some of the elections for sheriff in North Carolina.
Of course, that's a big election issue. Let's talk a little bit about the Lincoln-Riley Act.
Yeah.
And what it would do.
Yeah, so we've got these big issues. It makes sense that voters are looking at immigration.
Sure.
This is definitely a high-profile issue with the way the southern border and border security is going. And so we've got the Lincoln-Riley Act. We had a young woman who was murdered in Georgia, allegedly by an illegal immigrant there. And so they filed an act that requires ICE to arrest
Senator Budd?
Senator Budd, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Senator
yeah.
Budd and Senator Katie Britt, who actually gave the response to the
Sure.
State of the Union address.
Okay.
Yeah, so they filed a bill together that would require ICE to arrest illegal aliens for offenses like shoplifting and things like that.
Sure.
Kind of a longer list of things that they should arrest them for, and then mandate detention until their removal, and that's ICE's arrest. It would also empower attorneys general to sue the federal agencies responsible for Homeland Security and border security for actions on immigration that harm the state or the citizens in the state. Now, that would depend entirely on the nature of the attorney general that you have in your state. Here,
Okay.
if we had an attorney general like Josh Stein or maybe potentially Jeff Jackson, the likelihood that they engage in those sort of lawsuits seems pretty low. But on the other side, maybe seems pretty high. But neither one of those things really speaks to the sanctuary city, this kind of gray area where there's some controversy over whether or not they can detain the people. But there's some other bills that Bud has joined as a sponsor that I think our other senator, Senator Tom Tillis, was a primary sponsor of, and one's the Justice for Victims of Sanctuary Cities Act, which establishes a private right of action for victims of illegal alien crime or their spouses or parents or family members to sue the state or a sub-level entity like a sheriff's office or a county for not honoring detainer requests, and then that kind of alleged criminal is released and then commits another crime, reoffends, then the victims of that second crime can sue that entity for not honoring the detainer request. So that's another Tillis bill, and another one for a Detainer Enforcement Act that Tillis filed that clearly establishes the authorities for states and localities to actually honor these detainer requests.
Okay.
So it doesn't go directly to the state level. They want maybe the Sheriff's Association sounds like they want a federal lawsuit, some precedent set that they can actually put weight on to say, like, this is the way things should be. They need something solid on a legal basis there.
Sure.
These initiatives on the federal level in Congress seem to be aimed at clarifying those things so that they can better protect communities from people that are likely to repeat some of the crimes that people are arrested for and then released are horrific crimes. And the idea that we're releasing them back to the community seems kind of unconscionable. It's pointed out often that citizens of this country who commit crimes and satisfy their condition for bail or bond are also released back into the communities with a potential for them to reoffend.
Sure.
But this seems like a more common sense and straightforward thing, especially when we have such a large illegal immigration issue, that if it's documented that they are undocumented, then let's detain them and let ICE go ahead and process them to remove them from communities where they can cause further harm.
What's the appetite on Capitol Hill for these?
Yeah, so we've got a split Congress, obviously.
Yeah.
The House, this is going to be something that if it got passed over to the House side, you imagine they would support strongly with the Republican majority. The Senate, with the Democrat control, less likely, obviously, to get through there. But with immigration becoming such a forefront issue across the country and Democrats stepping out to try and kind of take this as an issue that they want to be tough on and Republicans are obstructing on, and some of the high-profile issues like the Lincoln-Riley murder, those things may create the conditions, enough pressure that they may act on some of these. But with the way politics is and wanting to get the win for your side, it seems unlikely that the Senate would actually pass this through.
From the North Carolina political angle, it'll be interesting to see whether Tom Tillis gets any bonus points among conservatives for filing this type of thing, because if you talk to grassroots conservatives, a lot of them don't like Tom Tillis and never have. And it'll be interesting to see whether that changes their views.
Are you seeing him trend more conservative in some of the things that he's done? I feel like I've been noticing a little bit of that.
I think it goes in fits and starts. I mean, Tom Tillis has charted his own path
Sure.
ever since he first got into politics. And sometimes he's right with the conservatives. He certainly was the person in charge of the House when North Carolina lowered tax rates,
Sure.
did a lot of things that conservatives like. But based on the very first election he had to the General Assembly and knocking out a big conservative favorite to win a primary, he's had a rough road with
Sure.
some elements of the conservative wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah, and he was definitely at the wheel there when they made those huge changes when they first came in. It
Right.
is interesting to see what happens. Do you think that any of the bills that they're talking about in Capitol Hill, would that meet the requirements from what you're hearing from the sheriffs?
Right. Yeah, I think so. Tillis, especially. I'm
Uh-huh.
not sure the Lake and Riley Act
Okay,
actually would address the issue of the policies, the
Okay.
state versus federal.
okay,
But I think what Tillis is backing, I'm pretty sure that would have a larger effect because he's specifically targeting sanctuary jurisdictions.
okay.
And also, he wants to clarify that the Department of Homeland Security, which is with
Sure.
ICE, has the authority. So if that
Okay.
can be clarified, then I think that would enable them to enforce that through all counties.
That's very interesting. So if they lift those barriers right now, would they really get on board and start doing it? That's the question, right? Because it's been really highly politicized. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, it's just interesting that this year, with the economy obviously front and center with inflation really high, that
Sure.
immigration has risen to be such
I was
a big
surprised too.
issue. And even Democrats are having to start to pivot to kind of discuss it. So, you never know what's around the corner with
Yeah,
politics.
that's true. All right. Well, good. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys doing all this and all this hard work. Head over to carolinajournal.com. You can read more on more analysis, more opinions, more news coverage of all of these issues, plus a lot more going on. Thanks for joining us.